Hey, everybody. This is your host, Nevin Gusak of the Politically Homeless Podcast. With me is Mr. Tyberius D. He is a fellow researcher. He is also on Twitch. He is a geopolitical enthusiast, like several of our other guests on this program. And today we're going to talk about a variety of topics. I've appeared on Tyberius' show on several occasions. Him and I have become friends over the long distance. We have many similarities in our belief systems and our concerns facing the country. But without further ado, welcome to the show, Tiberius. How you doing today?
It's been a bit of a wild day. Of course, Nevin knows this personally, but I'm going through a lot of changes in my life. So first of all, thank you for having me here. Love talking to Nevin. We talk on the phone quite commonly and quite oftenly. We just kind of really hit it off thanks to our good friend Connor. So I want to give a shout out to our good friend Connor on that one. But yeah, it's great to be here. Unfortunately, it is a bit of a rough day for me. And by the way, for anyone who's just watching, we're recording pretty late, so I'm not going with the full professional lighting because I got to go to bed after this, and I don't need to be in daytime mode. So all the particular formalities out of the way. It's great to be here. It's great to see you again, Nevin, and it's great to be on your show.
Thank you. It's great having you. I was doing my exercise before, going to Macy's Jewelry to pick up some gifts, and I had myself a nice small cup, pequeño vaso, for those of you who speak Spanish, of Cuban coffee, cortado, excuse me. So right now, doing pretty good, but eventually, like anything else, the gas will burn out, and I too will be going to bed because I have a busy weekend ahead of me. So let's start telling us a little bit about your show and your belief system. Could you tell us a little bit about the show, where you can find your show? And some people might not be familiar with our mutual friend Connor of Counterpoints. So if you want to just add some words about that.
Sure. So as far as my show, I've gone through a number of iterations. I've been streaming effectively, semi-consistently since about 2018. And the reason why is me and two other friends got together and we wanted to kind of be a centrist podcast between a former Democrat that was moving right, a former Republican that was moving left, and then a guy that we kind of found out later was a little crazy, but we'll deal with that where it comes. And it was going into the 2018 election cycle where everyone was just like, oh, hey, we're so polarized and all this stuff. And we're like, well, we'll kind of, cut through the rift and we'll get some people to talk common sense. Well, after, COVID made everyone go on the internet for a year, among other things, I have still been doing this because I kind of enjoy it. However, it's gotten to a point in my life where it's not my first priority, even my second. I've tried doing produced content. I've tried doing, just off the cuff stuff. And the reward to return ratio on just how much effort I put in on all the produced stuff just doesn't work. I don't know what it is about the online space, but when I'm talking to people tend to like me. Well, I engage with normal people in person. It's pretty good, but the online space is a little weird because there's people who are normal and sensible and they love me online, but then they see all these jackasses on, TikTok and Twitter and all this other stuff. And it's like, either you are stark raving mad or you are stark raving mad, just of a different political variety. And, unfortunately, it seems like the internet still is the home of the crazies. So I've not felt like I've had a lot of success on here. And when I consistently see what is doing well on Twitch or YouTube, I just, I die a little inside. So, if anyone wants to come check out my stuff, I largely am just a massive nerd and I rant about whatever I want. And I usually just bring in people that I like into my community, and we just do an open panel for a while. And we just hang out for a couple hours and we just talk about whatever the, is the situation of the day or whatever, happens to be on our mind. And it's been going pretty strong. We haven't lost viewership, but we don't really gain anything. So if you all want to be that +1, feel free to check us out on YouTube and Twitch.
Yeah, and plus you could also have the opportunity, if you also have credentials, or you have your show, maybe you're a self-published author or essayist, Tiberius is very, very accessible. And as long as you're a professional and you're pretty cool, I mean, you never know. Maybe you can join one of his online panels, of which he has a variety of guests. But now we're going to talk about you, Connor, a little bit more. Connor, excuse me, Tiberius.
You're good.
Jesus. You're basically almost indistinguishable from your political views, anyways. But what are your political views? Where did you start out as? Where are you now? Before we get into the issues of the day and unpack those, where are you generally? What's your evolution politically?
Well, the evolution story, and I'll try to keep this TLDR because it's got some sticky notes on it, but I'll basically say I grew up as I grew up in the fields of Southwest Indiana, right? So I've always had somewhat a little bit of a conservative leaning, just because, raised by farmers. You got to work hard. You got to do all this stuff. However, leaving my high school years, I basically fell into what is generally leftism because it predominates not only academia, but it predominates most of the teachers. I know there's been some pushback against that, but in general, I fell in with most of those belief structures anyway, because I'm young, and that's literally what they shoved down you, except for a handful of conservatives. It was really nice to have my conservative history teacher in high school because he was kind of alone in the night, but he could put up a fight, and it was always refreshing. And so even when I didn't always agree with him, like I generally respected them. And there's a lot of conservatives that I always have respected because they're good folks, they're hardworking folks. And it just seems like there was always a group of people in the background that always kind of drowned them out optically. And unfortunately, that seems to be so much more the worst these days. There's been a couple of events that have changed since the days I've left high school that have moved me more towards the right. Not only am I a homeowner, which I think actually, kind of puts me into a more conservative camp, but it's also the left isn't what it used to be. Like the left of Barack Obama, a lot of people are like, oh, they were always toxic. I'm like, nah, most of the time, if you ran in a campaign during like 2008 or 2012, like they would reward you for that. And if you, did all you did all your homework, you did all your effort, they would, reward you. Like you would get something out of the deal. Well, the problem is that in 2016, like I was a Bernie bro, actually. And I'm one of the people that went up and signed the petition that you need 100,000 signatures to be on the ballot in Indiana. And I'm one of them. I was one of the ones that went up to the state house and helped put that in. I actually participated in the democratic process more than just voting, right? However, when I, when I saw the Democrats lost and I thought they actually needed to go more populist left, I engaged with those folks and we tried to effectively, I don't know how to put it. We effectively tried to get rid of our county chair is what we did. We lost 22-32 as far as the delegates that we needed to get. But what really concerned me is that when we were going up for offices, I am literally the guy who kind of bitches and moans at the county Democratic meeting after the election loss. And I'm like, hey, look, I think we need to change. I think we need to move this direction. I think this is what our focus needs to be. And people liked what I had to say so much that we literally crammed, like me and like 2 or 3 other people crammed into a Chinese restaurant right down the road. And we started talking stuff and planning. I was there from day one. And when it came time to actually run up for elections and say, all right, this person's going to get this office and this person's going to get this office, I was on the list. And I had been there from the start. So I'm a little mad, but I'm like, all right, cool. What's your rationale? Please explain to me like what you want and why you want this person or that person. And the long and the short for me, and I'll just be very blunt about it, was this person is going to be up because they're a woman. This person's going to be up because they're a Hispanic woman. This person's going to be up because of, whatever identity you want to put. And the only person who was white was this old white straight dude, because he was basically bankrolling the whole affair. So I'm like, all right, cool. But I haven't seen this person for half the meetings because they didn't show up till halfway through. This person's been here since the start. However, they haven't been here for half the meetings because they got some other shit going on. And I'm like, I literally missed 3 meetings. I have been here for, I can't remember how long this particular campaign lasted, but it was, I think at least 2 months, and we were very active. We were trying to basically flip a county seat. Well, make a long story short, that rubbed me the wrong way. In a very big way. And I started hearing like some of those things about like, oh, hey, the Democrats don't care about what you do. They care about who you are and what you are. Well, that's become home for me. I cannot dissuade from that. So I started leaving the left in a general sense, particularly leftism, because I grew up in a family of meritocrats. Like if you aren't willing to put up or shut up, I'm not going to respect you. And if you're starting to give out positions because of what people are, and particularly for things they have no control over, you're going the wrong way for me. And it's only gotten worse since those days. We now know that our vice president is there, not just because the person's qualified. I don't like her, but there's levels where she totally is. But it's very clear that it's because of her minority status. She's literally the Voltron of identity politics. I had to get a joke in there.
Very well put. Right? Especially my generation. I remember the Voltron cartoons from the 1980s. I was an ardent watcher back in the day.
Right. I figured you'd really like that one.
Yeah.
And then, Justice Brown, which actually is probably one of the best justices that I've seen as far as credentials, she's there because of what she is, not who she is. And while you can make the argument, hey, there's plenty of people within minority groups that absolutely meet all the credentials, when you openly tell everybody that's what you're doing, this kind of seems, sexist and racist. Mm-hmm. So I had some serious problems with it, and it only got worse as I've gotten older, not only in the severity, but also in like the temperaments as far as like what's acceptable, what's not. Back in 2016, we had just owed Oberfell, and most people around here had no idea that trans people were even a thing. So like there's some things that have just kind of threw me for a while. Then, by the way, I don't have a problem with trans folks. There is some narratives that I have serious problems with, and hopefully we'll avoid all that because that's literally something that I have had beat to death with over and over and over again. So I just don't care to talk about it anymore. But yeah, basically where I'm at is the left really disgusted me and I started moving away. Unfortunately, as I was moving to the right got significantly worse. The right used to be the adults in the room. The Republicans, unfortunately, while being the party of big business in the DOD, were usually the people that was like, all right, cool, we got to make sure we balance our budgets or at least try to and do all these other things. And while they would, how should I say, not always, come up to snuff when it came to actually putting pencil to paper, they were significantly better than Democrats. Well, today we live in the era of MAGA, which I respect the fervor, I respect the ferocity, and I totally respect the ability to say, hey, these people were screwing us over for 30 years. We're just going to toss them out of the party. Okay, great. But now you just tossed all the brains out of the party. There's no one who does long-term planning in the Republican Party anymore. You've got a lot of zealotry, a lot of tenacity that I get, but I don't really agree with because it's not tempered. When you have Ron DeSantis openly saying on a debate stage, I am proud of a 6-week abortion ban, you just threw the general. Sorry. No, that's not going to fly. So long story short, I'm center right. I definitely think that some parts of like even old traditions of the New Deal were totally good. I think that Reagan had a point though, where he's like, hey, like government's now 1/3 of, GDP. Like we might want to figure out how to like rework that. Well, now it's up to 45% of GDP. Top to bottom of government spending is now part of the economy. Yeah, it's probably some time to rewrite the social contract. However, I don't want to make it to where it's a Darwinistic anarcho-capitalist hellscape. And I also don't believe in like blatant leftism because obviously I think their morals are junk. So I've got a little bit of old school conservatism. I've got some new age progressivism, and it's all kind of rolled into one. Some people would like to refer me as a Burkean conservative or a right-wing progressive. I kind of take both of those with a little bit of a tacit, but that's the TLDR version, unfortunately. So welcome to Complicated.
That's okay. I'm pretty complicated too. Or to summarize, and let me try and zoom my camera up to that picture. See that picture? That's my maternal grandfather. who I was close with right near, is Teddy Roosevelt. He is one of my political heroes. That sums up my political belief, as many in the audience know. We've discussed this before, Tiberius, offline, as well as on your program. There's quite a bit to unpack here. Again, to reinforce my beliefs, which I've done 10,000 times on this show as well as other programs. Basically, I call myself a radical civic nationalist. I used to be a Reagan conservative, then a John Bircher, and then I've become more, by today's parlance, a sort of populist with New Deal and civic nationalist tendencies. I support capitalism. I tend to stay away from the culture wars, pretty much because they're weaponized by various forces that seek the detriment of the American people, whether the plutocratic right or the tanky left or the Marxist left, both of which I oppose. Oppose fascism, National Socialism, Marxism, Leninism. I never was really attracted by the left because in a nutshell, they tended to, many, not all, but a number of people, quote unquote, on the left, particularly the Marxist-Leninist groups, the anti-American New Left types from the 1960s, early 1970s, they tended to, and the so-called peace groups, they tended to, with some exceptions, champion the enemies of the United States, meaning the old Soviet Union and China and its allies throughout the world, and now today in Russia and China and Cuba, Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I always opposed that. They always opposed, it seemed, any form of American power and America defending itself and having a strong national defense and internal security. So I oppose that. I oppose its deceptive totalitarianism and militarism. The right wing, I feel, living in a right to work, very right wing governed state by ardent Reaganites. And I love Florida very much for many, many different reasons. I really have no desire to leave the state. However, I can lodge one criticism. It's been since really, what was it, about 1999, 2000, we've been governed by a Republican governor, as well as also a Republican majority legislature in both houses. And really the cost of living has skyrocketed over the decades to the detriment of working and middle income people, and I dare say perhaps even small businesses too as well, depending which sector. I like to see the rebalancing of the bargaining power of labor and management and the investors, not only in this state, but the nation. Why? Because it will save capitalism, both its credibility as well as capitalism from its own contradictions. I would like to see the state have basically a Franklin Roosevelt in either party just lay the smackdown on the corporate lobbyists and, the reactionary elements that seek to move the state on the path to backwardness on an economic and social level, and make this state truly desirable, not just to out-of-state retirees who are collecting gargantuan pensions from union-friendly states and moving down here and translating those top dollars into a high standard of living, or wealthy outside investors and upper middle class people and the super rich here. Now, I want all those people here, but there has to be a rebalancing where people who actually work here as professionals and blue collar people and working poor people can be self-sustaining and self-sufficient. My issue at the right, when you look at the Ben Shapiros, when you look at other libertarians and neocons and Reaganites, they have a heavy helping of social Darwinism that really is frankly disgusting and undesirable, and it makes the radical left of the anti-capitalist forces much more appealing to younger people your age, as well as people who are Generation X like myself, more appealing. When it comes to the cultural wars, I generally call for what I term a pluralism of interests or pluralism of lifestyles, for the most part, with certain exceptions. I tend to be open and tolerant of most people as long as they support a strong United States of America and certain general principles of radical civic nationalists. I reject the class struggle. I'd like to cancel the class struggle. The class struggle is real, but the problem is when you have a class struggle, it leads towards the embracing of extremist ideologies of Marxism or perhaps even neo-fascism as properly defined. I want to avoid that, so I want to cancel the contradictions of capitalism and the class struggle as much as possible. So when right-wingers hear me, they think, oh, you're giving credence to Marxism. But in order to fight Marxism, we have to tell certain truths that are very painful and uncomfortable rather than the kissing the ass of American exceptionalism and capitalism uber alles. So we have to be creative and strategic in our thinking. That's my thinking in a nutshell. I consider Russia and China our primary adversaries. I don't want to create conditions for shooting war. So I depart from people like Senators Lindsey Graham or Senator Wicker from, I believe, I think it was Mississippi, and Chris Christie years ago in the Republican primary in 2015, 2016, saying no fly zone over Syria to shoot down Russian aircraft. But I think we should have no illusions. Russia and China are geopolitical enemies, and especially united can potentially inflict severe damage on the United States. And we've allowed ourselves and have opened ourselves to those countries, believing that the Cold War ended in 1991. And I've written quite a bit about these topics, and others like our frequent guest Jared Nyquist and Trevor Loudon and others have written about this. So I think we have to prepare this country internally, restore and re-strengthen the fundamentals of this country, both on national defense as well as social cohesion, to face Russia and China. We know that Russia, China obviously, is expanding its global influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. We know Russia and China have been encouraging various extremist groups in Europe, Latin America, and the United States to subvert the United States to make their systems more appealing. I mean, Putin, Xi Jinping, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, all of them have all stated that they're creating and constructing a new world order based on the principles directly opposed to neoliberalism as represented by the United States. Of course, on the foreign policy front, and when it comes to exporting our system, we have to dump neoliberalism, stop aiding our enemies, and slowly and strategically and intelligently decouple ourselves not from Russia and China and reindustrialize the United States, much of which can come from reorienting capitalism currently as configured as all about shareholders and financialization and shareholder uber alles, more towards old school American capitalism based especially on the American school of political economy of Henry Carey, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and others. So now I'm going to shut up. I give him my encyclopedic version of my economics, politics, and geopolitics. I'm going to throw the questions back at you. I'm just saying this so your audience knows where I'm coming from, and I guess it reinforces what I believe in with my audience. Now, concerning the left, so let me get straight. What upset you about the left was more the ID poll or identity politics. What kind of leftist were you? Were you this raging, tanky Marxist-Leninist? Or were you more kind of like a Bernie-crat social democrat who just wanted to kind of polish the rough edges off of capitalism, but not really fundamentally overthrow it and usher in a socialist system? So take that away. Let's talk to me about that.
Yeah. So as far as what kind of leftist I was, the problem is I didn't know the theory super duper well. I'm a policy guy first. The ideology comes second for me always. Which is why I have such a problem fitting into a lot of anything. Is just I don't really go with the cookie cutter stuff. I'm like, all right, cool. I think this policy works, but this policy doesn't. And I'm one of these guys that in the modern day, I think food stamps is a disaster, but I think Medicare for all actually would probably be pretty effective. So if you can split that in your head, have fun, because I don't know what ideology that belongs to. Let me get into that leftism thing, though. I don't think I would ever go full bore enough to say that I was a dim sock, although I had some leanings into that. What I definitely was like a new age FDR, like social democrat, because I do think that there was a lot of balances that kind of came off, and I had no problem with being socially progressive to a large degree. I'm actually kind of a hippie at heart. You just really got to make me upset in regards like you have done something that is both either like ethically monstrous or more particularly that um, you have to just basically be a lazy bastard that doesn't do anything. And I will, one of those two, I'll write you off, but more often than I won't. Um, the problem that I got into is that um, a lot of these young folks became a bunch of what we call LARPers, to where Democrats used to be the party of the unions. Democrats used to be the party of the working class, and I wanted to believe in that, and for a long time I did. Right, like my whole county used to be a solid Democratic, or excuse me, my county used to be a Democratic stronghold for a very long time. Uh, Agriculture community, most farmers voted Democrat all the way up until 2016. But as things have changed, a lot of people don't believe that anymore, and neither do I. I don't really believe that the Democrats are what they claim to be, particularly what the leftists do. And I actually agree with the criticism that the leftists partner with the liberals is kind of oxymoronic in a large degree, because you're talking about people who want to basically rewrite or tear down the system versus the people who run most of the institutions. So in general, like I was definitely a sock dem, just social democrat. I wanted to expand a number of things, wanted to curb some of the influences. However, I got older, and part of my transition more into a right wing structure is that regulatory capture is a really big thing for me. I've kind of examined some things, and a lot of the things that we can use to protect people are some of the things that form the market conditions that can actually destroy people too. That's a huge thing for me, is that a lot of the ways that we see monopolies form is that you don't get a monopolies in a highly free market environment. You get monopolies whenever you are able to corner the market through a bunch of institutional regulations to go, all right, cool, you're a new car company, well, you need a couple $1 billion to start that up. That's a pain in the ass as it is, right? But then, oh, not only do you have to have a couple $1 billion to start up just making the cars, but you have to have climate regulations and fuel mileage regulations and safety regulations. And while some of those we absolutely need, there's some of those where it's just like, you keep stacking all these regulations up, and you've just made it to where the only people who can participate in that system are the people who are already in it, and nobody can get in. And at that point, you are effectively have a ticking clock on your market there. You're going to have a monopoly sooner or later.
Well, and monopolies also, and I think you mentioned some very good points. And, I have some social democratic tendencies. It makes perfect sense regarding your concern about the food stamps and other transfer payments, as well as in-kind programs like food stamps that provide basically money for food and whatnot. I think the biggest way to reduce, frankly, we have a relatively, compared to the rest of the industrialized capitalist or mixed economy countries, we tend to have a parsimonious welfare state in comparison. But the way to really effectively, incredibly reduce the need on welfare, which I agree with as a goal, of course, is through strong unionization, where the labor and the employees in general have strong bargaining power, where they're able to win wage concessions as long as a company or organization is solvent or is profitable, whether public sector or private sector. This way, people can be self-supporting. They can make enough money on their own where they afford basic goods and services, as well as also the opportunities to go on vacations and entertain other forms of entertainment. And of course, I'm more of a Keynesian when it comes to, because Keynesian is not counterintuitive, whereas supply side economics is counterintuitive. Keynesian is, if you have more money in your pocket, you're going to invest it in your 401k or some other pension plan. You're going to invest it in a new car. You might save the money to open up a new business or take your girlfriend or your wife out to a nice dinner, whatever. That money recycles in the economy. So that's the way to getting back. I know I digress, but that's the way to really kind of really lower the need for both public welfare programs as well as also this dependency on private charity. In fact, when more people have money in their pockets, they'll be able to then donate more to private charities too as well. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned Medicare for all. I would like to see insurance companies, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, either people in the audience or Ty, if you can, Tiberius, if you can correct me if I'm wrong. At one time, decades ago, private insurance companies were run on a nonprofit basis as well as hospitals. I would get back to that first. If that doesn't work, then I would reconfigure capitalism once again away from the shareholder model, because you have big pharma executives and health insurance executives admitting on record that, hey, look, we're really not interested in patients. We're interested in enhancing shareholder value. And if we reconfigure public corporate law and the mentality in the business schools away from that worldview of just about boosting the stock prices, the end and all of the operations of a publicly traded company like a pharmaceutical firm or a health insurance firm, then I think we can kind of improve the healthcare system dramatically. If that fails, then I would go to, I would nationalize the health insurance industry entirely, give the investors a fair return during the buyout as much as possible. That would obviously have to be negotiated and handled gingerly, and then I would move forward. However, I would keep the disbursement of medicine totally privatized because you need competition. You have a shitty doctor you go to, especially if you're in a big city or a large town, there are other opportunities where you can go where, oh, that doctor is good, that doctor's shitty, fuck you, you suck, I'm going to the good doctor across the street. So that's why I support capitalism, a large measure of capitalism. And basically, the problem with economics, either the hardline Marxist economists or Marxist believers in the confiscation, or as Marx termed it, the despotic inroads into private property on the one side, and this sort of callous asshole libertarianism or Reaganite social Darwinism or Marxist genocidal totalitarianism against basically the private sector and whatnot, the theft essentially. The problem I have is they're both extreme and they're ideological and they're both counterintuitive and against human nature. One extols the collective and basically the state as the be end and all, and the other is all about the rat race and just basically trampling over others. And just if you get trampled and you die in the process, people dying in the street, oh, well, fuck you. That's the law of the free market, law of the jungle, not my problem. So sad. Go get a GoFundMe. Good luck, and that's it. Both are not healthy. Both are anti-nationalists. I'm a civic nationalist, and they're both poisonous for nationalism. Now, concern the monopolies, I think you bring up some really good points, and you can elaborate with them after I'm done. But one thing that has been really historically problematic for small business startups is the fact that we have allowed, since Ronald Reagan shut down antitrust effectively, starting in the early 1980s, what has happened is the leveraged buyouts, mergers and acquisitions, which became, of course, known as private equity. And basically, the way to talk about LBOs and private equity and mergers and acquisitions, basically, imagine yourself chewing some tobacco. We got some school tobacco. Roll it up, stick it in the side of your mouth. I've never done it, but I know people who have. And you chew it, you get the good flavor out of it and everything and whatnot. And then it outlives its usefulness. You spit it in the chew bottle and you're done, and you throw that shit out. That's private equity. You strip the assets of these companies. Think Eddie Lampert of Sears, was a big admirer and follower of Ayn Rand. He ran Sears right into the fucking ground. Why? Asset stripping. Strips the assets, loads the company with debt. They might have a few companies that are really doing well, but the rest of the companies are just stripped of their assets bare. And then the company is a shell of itself. Poor service. Companies become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like the Blob from, the movie from 1958 and the remake from like 1988. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it snuffs out the competition. When you really read the history, the so-called conservatives, who, well, they're really not conservatives. They're radicals for untrammeled power by private capitalist oligarchs. That's really what Reaganomics is. And Democrats like Clinton and Obama, in some ways, despite his radical left and pro-communist past, Clinton, Trump, or I call them Clint-Bama, and Trump and Reagan and both Bushes, they all pretty much have adhered or appointed people who have adhered to this trickle-down economics or Reaganomics, and much of which gives a green light to mergers and acquisitions, i.e. private equity. And that's where I see the biggest problems for monopolies is through the proliferation of just mergers and acquisitions that have been around since the early 1980s. I will say I'll give Biden and Lena Khan, his FTC commissioner, credit for trying to put the brakes. There are a few cases. Matt Stoller on Twitter is really good about this. He follows these issues very closely. There are some mergers and acquisitions that it seems like they're putting on ice right now. So I think there needs to be not only a continued national conversation about mergers and acquisitions, but we need to tell also the truth of why monopolization has occurred. You see, of course, how Walmart has come in, driven out a lot of small businesses, both in rural as well as urban centers. You see that with Amazon and whatnot. And Amazon has a lot of positive aspects of it when it comes to being a clearinghouse for a variety of goods and services. But you also have to look at also how small businesses, people have really, family businesses that have been generations in the hands of people, and you have small businesses. I grew up with them in Great Neck, New York, which is my hometown. And these people were pillars of the community. Everybody knew each other. They knew each other's kids. You grew up with them, and it created a sense of social cohesion. And now the themes I'm just sitting on, that is true conservatism, not the bilge spewed by people like Larry Kudlow and Stephen Moore and the Heritage Foundation and the Club for Growth. These are libertarianism. These are radicals for the corporate capitalist oligarchs, who, by the way, have no problem declinking champagne glasses with communist China, communist Vietnam, Putin's Russia, and all the rest of it too, by the way. So before you guys call me a commie, try to apply a little nuance, guys. So, because I get that sometimes. I think people call me a socialist for saying that, but they don't. There's a lot of lack of political sophistication, just like I'm sure you've been called a socialist, Ty, even though that's not true. And this is where I think YouTube and Twitch are good avenues for people like us, where we can have a voice. Because I mean, we're not going to be on Chris Cuomo or Glenn Beck or CNN or Fox News or any of these channels. That's why we have to start these channels to get our voice out. So I'm going to shut up right now. I'll let you respond to my political insanity.
Well, I appreciate all of that. The problem is that I think I'm up to about a page and a half of just rudimentary notes on that. So I'm going to need your help here. All right. So I can shit talk Florida for about 5 minutes if you want. We can go down Russia, China. I've got the power between labor and business. We've got health insurance, and we also have the new religions that are like liberalism, communism, fascism, and we can even get into socialism. So, like, where do you want to take me here?
And a partridge in a
pear tree. Yeah, fair enough. All right, so tell me where you gotta go, because this is your show, and I've got way too much I want to reply to out of that. So.
Oh wow! All right, I will take shit talking Florida for 100. But I must admit I love Florida. I love the people, the diversity, the food, the beaches. And all of you know by now, I am a water sports enthusiast. I'm a fitness workout enthusiast. There are some things I do agree with the conservative governance of the state too as well, and we can talk about that. And that's, of course, and I do have still, believe it or not, I mean, I was talking about it offline with my friend Trevor Loudon, who's a lead anti-communist researcher. There are even even though I shit talk libertarianism, there are some things I do like about libertarianism that I just have some diehard, like, kind of tendencies I don't want to let go of. So it gets complicated even more. So, but let's talk about Florida, the pros and the cons, to be fair to my state, because I love it.
All right, so geopolitical nerd time go. Along the short here, there's a couple of states that I'm looking at seem to have a pretty bright future, pretty decent future looking forward. And that's either because they are looking to reinvent themselves or because they just happen to be in the right place at the right time with the current political arrays kind of like going towards their direction. There are also a couple of other states that have kind of gone the opposite way. They are destined for very poor outcomes in the future, and either that is because the tide is turning against them. Great example would be West Virginia, unfortunately, or you have you have states that are unfortunately so locked in with their general establishment of, whoever runs the state is basically locked in, that they are destined to failure because they're not going to be able to change and meet the demands of what their future holds. We're already seeing with this California, but hot take, the next state that's going to do this is going to be Florida. Long story short with Florida. Florida is a problematic state. Geopolitically, it doesn't have a lot of anything that you can do in the extraction services outside of tropical agriculture. It's pretty good for that. Anything south of I-10 is, pretty well for growing that kind of thing. However, what it comes down to is that you've had a lot of money and a lot of interest flooded into the state since basically air conditioning became superfluous, right? And while that has led to enormous amount of growth, Orlando went from something like 50,000 people, like in the 1960s, to now a major metropolitan area of over 2 million. Tampa is now huge. Miami-Dade is huge. When we get into all of this, you have the California problem, but just in the opposite direction. You've got a lot of people with a lot of money who are constantly like coming in and reinvigorating the system. You got your snowbirds coming in, and they want the system the way it is. However, basically the rub here is that the more that these folks come in, the more that the state is not able to handle its challenges. The state seriously needs to increase its gas tax and more particularly its transportation bill. That's why half of your roads are toll roads down there, or at least half of the ones that are any good and you can get anywhere on. Most of the place is not building out roads in the degree that you need to. Like, you guys might have to take some notes from the Texans on this one. You don't have enough freeways and just basic levels of connection to where Florida is now becoming, how do I say this without being completely obtuse? Florida is basically becoming a giant traffic jam throughout the entirety of the state. Okay? In fairness, you still have CSX largely trying to literally supercharge its facilities within within Florida. However, the problem with that is that we are car country and we are truck country. And we have not put in the major work needed to really make trains effective in the 21st century. And I'm not even talking about high-speed rail. I'm talking about the fact that you have an interstate, which is a freeway, that goes around the city and never has to go usually below 55 miles an hour. And if they're built half decently, they can still maintain 70 all the way around the urban area. But trains never got that. So they have to go, unless they literally are able to put up massive amounts of money, and we're talking about billions of dollars here, to build the right-of-way, get the right-of-way, get the eminent domain, then actually build new rails all the way around these areas and make it to where you can't run a road through it. They can't compete because there's still so many of these areas and sections to where you're in a train and your speed limit is reduced to basically 35 miles an hour. If trains can get up to 70 and stay at 70 and also work on their changeover in how they move goods and services, they can seriously become competitive with trucks again. But until we do that, we have a problem. And Florida is the number one state that's actually eating on this one, because while you have your ports and you have a number of other avenues, The amount of people that are now in Florida, and particularly the fact that your avenues are very limited, right? Because of how many swamps and lakes you guys have. There's only certain places you all get funneled into you can only deal with. You're not using your modes of transportation effectively enough. And there's nothing about Florida right now that's even wanting to change that outside of maybe Brightline. And that's not what you need. You need freight. You need to be able to move freight for 22 million people. Mm-hmm. So the long and the short here is that this is going to kill Florida in the long term. Unless you guys have a concentrated build out of infrastructure to either supercharge the ports, which is probably not going to happen because of the Jones Act, or you have a super concerted effort into tripling your highway miles or at least doubling your rail miles. You are literally going to get bogged down to the point where in about, I'd say it's 5 years, but it might be 10, where you're going to be one of the most highly inflationary states because you just cannot move goods and services quick enough or effectively enough for all the people you have in your state. And it's going to
we are actually the worst state when it comes to inflation right now for goods and services, from what I understand. I think you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, Florida is a mixed bag. It does have, obviously, like other states, it has infrastructure. It has extensive infrastructure. Does it need improvements? There's no doubt. The highways, particularly in the Miami-Dade, Broward County areas, are being expanded. I-75, I-95, the Florida Turnpikes, Homestead Extension, et cetera, et cetera. There is quite a bit of lane widening. Much of this is also the toll lanes called express lanes that are going to be tolled to as well. So that's going to be basically another tax imposed by the state on average Floridians right there to pay for that. So that's a challenge unto itself. When it comes to the ports, the major ports are Tampa, not St. Petersburg, but Tampa, Jacksonville, Port Everglades, which is the port in Fort Lauderdale, and the Port of Miami, both on the Miami River, which handles freighters from the Caribbean countries, as well as the Port of Miami proper. Florida's opportunity, and then there is the railroads, notably in this area up and down the East Coast, the Florida East Coast Railroad, which does handle freight. The way Florida could get out of this, its problems, well, number one, I would get rid of right-to-work laws, both on a federal level as well as a state level. I would try to do a grand bargain. This is where you need an FDR figure. If the fucking Democratic Party here get its damn head out of its ass and stop running Charlie Crist and other lackluster candidates to run against these oligarchic Republicans, if you have a labor-friendly, patriotic Democrat that declares a truce on the culture war issues, you might actually get some freaking traction. So anyways, once you get a Democrat, or dare I say I would love a Republican, since I'm technically a registered Republican who's pro-labor and pro-business, and stop basically dancing to the tune of the industry lobbyists. I mean, you look at Jason Garcia's Twitter feed, who's an investigative reporter in Florida. It's like everything the Florida legislature is coming out with is, we're private loan shark companies can raise their interest rates to quadruple digits, basically. That's in the State House right now. Yeah, it's I'm exaggerating about quadruple digits, but it's really high amounts, exploitative, usurious amounts. It's ridiculous. So what has to happen is there needs to be rebalancing the state. That's how you cut the public welfare budgets. Not that the welfare down here is very generous. It's not. You can rest assured about that. But you become people more self-sustaining on a legislative level. I guess I'm imagining Florida as its own independent country. Imagine that. I would then create what I would call a labor management arbitration tribunal that will settle labor disputes and deadlocks if there are strikes, to use basically compulsory bargaining if things get out of hand, where you have impartial judges from labor and capital as long as they fit certain ideological criteria, will be able to serve as referees if need be. Otherwise, I believe free bargaining between strong unions and also a strong business sector, because you can't have a union that's the unions that are more powerful than business, because my goal is not to kill capitalism, it's to resolve as best as possible its contradictions. So you get that in this state, people will have more money in their pockets, they'll be able to afford goods and services, and hopefully that'll blunt the inflation, which, by the way, is caused by corporate profiteering, the massive gargantuan corporate profits, and they've been taking advantage of it. And they've been admitting that too. There was a good story not long ago in stories in the Wall Street Journal that have covered that too as well. And also the supply chain issues that have been developed by free trade and globalism, and the shock caused by COVID-related supply chain interruptions and delays have shocked our system too as well. So on a national level, I would get back to the United States slowly but surely becoming much more self-sufficient. So anyways, that's on a grander national scale. Florida, I would definitely expand on Brightline, and it's not cheap to go on Brightline, by the way, if you look up the tickets. So I would make that more of a public service, and I would basically do high-speed rail between all the major Florida cities and vacation destinations, hopefully linking into a grander national high-speed rail too as well. I would also, some of the Florida ports, I believe, do handle the super ships. Anybody in your chat or in my comments, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they can handle the post-Panamax ships. I would definitely encourage that. And lastly, I would improve, if necessary, and expand, I agree, on the CSX network, freight rail too as well. Now, I know freight rail is handled at the ports. I would increase that. And I would, of course, make the freight trains, once again, as safe as possible. I know because of deregulation of the railroads, particularly in the 1990s and onwards, there were new business models that were put into effect where you had fewer personnel and longer trains. So I would roll that deregulation back to where the trains are adequately staffed with engineers and other personnel. This way, we have a much more safer handling of freight to and fro, because I'm a big supporter of freight rail and passenger rail. Unlike other states, one of the problems with Florida is inland waterborne commerce is basically non-existent. In my state of New York and other states like Connecticut, New Jersey, especially back when I was younger, we used to have like barge systems where they would take oil from the oil refineries in New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Delaware, and they take barges to smaller oil terminals, or sand or gravel or crushed rock to smaller asphalt or cement plants. We don't have that here because of the way of the zoning and real estate development has proceeded at pace, which is heavily concentrated on recreation as well as also housing, particularly luxury housing and whatnot, which is not in itself an entirely bad thing. But to make up for that, we're going to have to just do continued highway widening as well as a massive, if needed, expansion of freight rail too as well. Florida has a lot of opportunities. The economic sectors, aside from real estate, tourism, and finance, are also agriculture, particularly fruits, sugar, vegetables. I would keep that going. There is a food processing industry. There are a bunch of sugar refineries north of the Everglades. There are several of them. I would keep those operational. Florida does have an industrial sector, for example, in mining. Phosphates, for example, Mosaic Corporation is a known employer in this state. That's something I would support. But I think the biggest struggle that Florida is facing is not only transportation, as you and I have brought out very eloquently in much detail, but I would also definitely look at the wage and salaries. I know I sound, with no disrespect to autistic people per se, but I sound autistic about it because it's not being addressed widely enough. And that's an issue that I'm going to hammer until the cows come home to roost, is the wage and salary issue in this state. You have rooms for rent. Here in Coral Springs, where I live, I see advertisements for $1,150 a month to rent a fucking room. That is pathetic. People cannot have families or even be couples and whatnot to rent a room. You look at landlord restrictions on that, for example. You have a homeless problem that is very bad. I mean, I work as a manager for the Lauderhill Central Park Library. Love my job. A lot of the homeless customers are really good, but you have an increase on homeless people, and they're always welcome in the library to use it for legitimate uses or whatnot. I have no problem with that, personally and officially. But it is a huge problem. You see them on the street corners in the major urban centers. So it's a huge problem. You have the YouTuber Southern Life, which is Jose and Katie, document that really well on their show, the homeless epidemic here. That's another thing that's being swept on the rug too as well. And you have people living in their cars and whatnot who are working people, not only in other states, but in Florida. So that's something I would really tackle along with the infrastructure. And I would just capitalize on Florida's natural wealth, which is its public universities, its goods producing sector, particularly in agriculture. And I would also ensure that the public education system, there is massive class size overcrowding despite the issues here. Florida has spent tens of millions of dollars on high stakes testing. I would really tamp that down. I would make reoriented Florida's public education system into a variety of real world courses about the frickin' real world and how it operates. What is labor? How does business operate? The importance of entrepreneurship. Those would be mandatory classes. How to balance a checkbook, how to cook, how to fix things, basic handyman work, and things of that nature. Vocational education will be vastly expanded by Governor Gussack if he had his way in this state. Obviously, and I would reduce class sizes. I would increase teacher pay by at least $10,000 to $20,000 a year to catch up with the inflation that is plaguing the state, to make it truly competitive and to attract the best talent. Teachers are not the enemy. Bad teachers is not the only problem here. The problem is that teachers are being shit on by the political establishment in this state, basically saying they're a bunch of lazy ass motherfucker public employees. And, you know, I know teachers. My ex-wife is in part of the education system. Say what we want about her. One of her virtues is that bunch of virtues she has is she is a hard worker. And many of her colleagues are hard workers devoted to their professions. They need a raise, you know, and I'm not saying bad teachers should be retained, but we also have to look at also what constitutes a bad teacher. There is many factors affecting student performance, and it's not merely just having a good or bad teacher. It's also their home life, their nutrition, and, you know, their exposure to reading and educate the importance of education and whatnot. And lastly, not everybody is meant for college, and that's okay. People who work in HVAC or other electrician professions, plumbers and whatnot, make more than people with master's degrees, and that is fine by me. That is okay by me, as a matter of fact. So we need to really do massive public investments in that, because on the other hand, that encourages more entrepreneurship. So the type of so-called welfare state that I advocate is basically giving the people the tools who don't have the resources so they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. In other words, giving people the boots and their laces and saying, okay, you got the resources. Now it's up to you to tie your own laces and become a success, become educated, get that degree, get good grades, start your business or work for a company and whatnot. So that's my Florida plan. So again, I'm going to get the libertarian Reagan. I love DeSantis and I hate poor people and working class people because they're lazy and overfed. And then the Marxists say, well, you want to save capitalism and therefore you're a class enemy. And, and the fascists are like, okay, I hate black people and I hate Jews and I hate capitalism. So you're not one of us either.
I see. I activated your trap card there. I thought we were going for shit talking Florida for 100, but I think we betted 1,000 on that one.
I'm sorry.
But
a lot of this applies to Florida because this is stuff that I would like to see for Florida.
Right. Like, don't get me wrong. There's things I think that definitely need to be looked at in Florida. There's some things that I definitely think need to be looked nationwide. I'll try to TLDR this as quick as I can because I've got more notes than I had before. So just for the Floridians out there, just so you know that I'm not completely full of crap. I would say that any of these corridors you need to have expressways with, but you also need to have rail corridors with that you just put it into the put it in with the building code there, like within 5 miles of any of these corridors, there needs to be at least some rail linkages that you can get in and out of with rail and they can move. Doesn't have to be high speed, but at least make freight trail be able to go up to 80 miles an hour. All right. So just quick shot here. US 98, which is kind of being worked in as Florida 589. And this is largely coming out of Tampa. It needs to go to Tallahassee. If you finish out that corridor, it will do you a huge. One of the big things I have with the wide laning or like just widening lanes is that it'll work, but the problem is you're only giving people one avenue. And this is why Atlanta sucks to drive through right now. There's only one way to get through Atlanta, and that's whatever way you're going. Like, you can't even go around it. If you continue to do this, this is one of those things that's going to like completely shut down your state. So yeah, US 98, which is if you guys continue with the 589 project, fine, that will work for you. You got to get it up to Tallahassee, and you need to do it sooner rather than later. Next is US 17, pretty much throughout the entire state. That just needs to be brought up to full freeway standard. It will do you a significant amount of good. However, you're talking a lot of money. Next is US 3.
And a lot of eminent domain issues on US 98 and US 17 too as well, because you're going through a lot of Central and West Coast Florida communities. I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to interject that.
I don't disagree, but if you guys do not start hammering on some of this to where like you are making it where people can get around more than just one interstate, you're going to have problems.
It's true. It's true. It might involve even developing beltways too as well, because I remember the Sawgrass Expressway, which is State Route 869. I remember coming down here in 1997, and that was kind of its, the hidden, less traveled route, and it gets crowded. I mean, 595, forget it. Even with the express lanes installed, I-595, crowded. 95, forget about it. I can't stand 95. I mean, it's
crowded.
The infrastructure was good for at one time. It was able to handle the traffic capacity, but now it is just overwhelmed, particularly in Tampa, St. Petersburg, Orlando, and the Tri-County area, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade County. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. They do need to really have a conversation about integrating the overflow from I-95 onto the turnpike. The turnpike needs to be upgraded anyway. It's too small for the traffic it's trying to handle. And the fact that thing isn't like that thing's a moneymaker. I don't know why they have not put in the money to just fix it up at this point, but whatever. Anyway, just finishing up.
I would definitely it's a good point, and you reminded me of something. The turnpike north of the Boynton Beach tolls to Orlando, it's 2 lanes each way. I've traveled that many times. They call the turnpike the less stress way. Between those 2 cities, it is definitely a stressful road, and you have a lot of tourists during season going to Orlando, to Kissimmee proper, for the theme parks, Universal, Disney, etc. A lot of traffic. I would expand that by another lane each way. So totally agree with you. Great point. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, US 301. I think I covered that one. US 27, largely south of Orlando. You definitely want to upgrade. And then the final one is Florida 70. That largely goes east-west. It's one of the few that haven't, but you guys are running out of east-west roads, particularly through Central Florida, just north of Lake Okeechobee. That would help you a lot. You get these corridors up and running. I would say just by the amount of traffic and people you have, all of these are going to need to be three-way, one-way expressways each. But if you're willing to dump the money into that, make that happen, Florida can probably stave off doom for a while, because at the rate you're going, you're going to have 30 million people there by the end of 2040, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
You all are going to have to stop growing if you don't want to just have enough headaches. So yeah, that's my Florida takes. Yell at me later if you are from Florida and for some reason disagree with me. Let's talk balance of labor a little bit here, because I know you've been punching on this one. I definitely think this is a national issue. I don't think this is just a state issue. And if you want to go, state by state and actually get rid of right to work laws, I'm not going to bitch about it, because I largely look at unions in the same way that I do police, fire, and guns. It sucks if you don't have, it sucks to have to deal with them, because if you don't feel like you need them, you're kind of like, what's the point? But if you don't have them, you are up shit creek without a paddle. And that's really what unions really feel like to me. More often than not, is that, yeah, they're a pain in the ass. They've got a bunch of extra conditions already on top of your employment, which are really annoying, to be completely honest. But on the other side of this is that if you need someone to fight for you because you're all about to get laid off, or more particularly if you, for some reason, the corporation is saying they've got another year of record profits, but, the wages are no wage increases in the budget somehow, once again, right? If you guys are tired of hearing about that, that's what a union's for, and that's what they're damn good at. We have seen that this year, or well, technically last year now. We have seen, particularly in the auto workers, and we're seeing it expand out and everywhere else. Everyone's going on strike. They're tired of the crap. Like, oh, you're cool. You made another year in record profits. That's great. Where's our cut? Oh, what? You're not no cut? Oh, okay. Well, we're going on strike. Like, we're getting our cut. We're done playing games. And I'm very curious to see how long this continues for. But I think the number one thing we need to do, and this is where I really get into some ruffle some feathers, free trade's a joke. We need to stop free trade, particularly with people that we don't like. We have empowered China.
Like us, or who don't like us.
Yeah, we've empowered China. We have basically expanded our labor pool from, if you will, 800 million developed world citizens that roughly make some level of like equivalent amount of money. And when you bolt in free trade, where it allows China and India and all these other countries to compete who make $2 a day, you have radically shifted your labor dynamics to favor them instead of you. And after about 30 to 40 years of this, we have gotten to the point where all those middle-class jobs that you could start in at the ground floor, and then by the time you retired, you were designing the car, they're not here anymore. Those are the most wealth-generating jobs you can do in any economy. It's part of the value-added skill. There's a couple of different ways to make wealth, but the number one way to make wealth is to literally make things more, literally make things that are more valuable than the things that you came with. So as an example, just going up this scale real quick, you have sand. Sand isn't really useful outside of a few specific things, like you can shoot it on a train tracks to give that train more traction. But if you melt it, all of a sudden you have glass. Glass is kind of cool. And if you take it another step and you cut it and you put some wood beams in it, whatever, you got a window. And then you obviously put that into a house, right? Each step in that generates a higher level of value each time that you go. And so whether you're talking about everything from iron ore or aluminum bauxite to, final end product, which is a freaking jet engine, right? That's how you make more money in any given economy than any other way. Whether it's speculation, whether it's transportation, whether it is literally just value accretion. You cannot compete with manufacturing. It makes more money. It makes way more money than any other way of generating value. So My whole thing is you've got to bring this crap back to the USA, and you got to do it quick. Now, if you want to put it out for some other people to do because you want to have a benefit, I strongly support empowering Mexico and just tying them into our economic system because we want a strong, stable Mexico to help with the immigration crisis. That's what we need to do. But giving it to people who, one, don't like us, two, may even hate us, and three, do not want to play by any kind of fair rules, nah, this needs to go. This needs to go last year. And even without the unions, this is going to make significant changes in the U.S. labor dynamics because you're going to effectively double the demand for labor when you start saying, hey, we have to do everything here, or, we have to do a lot more here. Because at least by every data point that we've had a labor surplus for 50 years. And it looks like it's kind of starting to go the other direction because all the boomers are retiring, but it's not enough. Like, at least by some data points here, we still have a 20% labor surplus, which is why even though you keep seeing these job reports coming out and it's like, wow, we've got 100,000 new jobs, coming out, this quarter or even this month, right? Why is it that wages are only still growing 2% on the year? It's because we still have so much more room to satisfy all these labor demands because of the fact that we have a large population that's still relatively youthful, but more particularly, and this is the big deal, is that most of the jobs that we have are unskilled labor that much people will just hyper compete for, while the jobs that everybody actually needs to tier into are largely these jobs that either people aren't looking at for some reason, like being an electrician or a plumber or whatnot. This is largely my generation's fault. We said don't do it, right? And then the other part here is it's walled out. There's a lot of these jobs that are you need a bachelor's degree to get, and they won't train you on the job, or they will not take you at some kind of like, oh, you have 4 years experience in something that's related. That has to die. That has to die horribly, and it needs to die soon because if anyone wants to bitch about the elites or the institutions and all this other stuff, that's where I would put my my foot down on. Stop having institutions gatekeep who's coming in just because you got a ticket from somewhere, which clearly does not indicate your intelligence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on basically everything that you said. Concerning free trade, it's been a disaster. Free trade has, first of all, on national security grounds, much of our industries have been outsourced, defense industries or defense-related industries. We still have some internally, but you look at, for example, who we've decades importing steel from, trade rivals like Japan, South Korea, as well as adversaries like Russia and China. One of the reasons why I supported Trump, even on shows, other shows in the past, or critical support, for Trump, like on American Survival, Roku TV, and other venues, is because of the trade issue. He was the first Republican really since Barry Goldwater, the first Republican presidential candidate since Barry Goldwater when he ran in 1964, who had more protectionist, economic nationalist leanings. There was the presidential candidate, not primary candidates. And I supported Trump because of that, his support for reindustrializing the United States. And he at least said that and talked about those themes since at least the late 1980s. I refer his interviews on the Oprah Winfrey Show from the late 1980s. It's still available on YouTube for those of you to listen to it, where he was very critical of Reagan for massively increasing the trade deficit as well as the national debt, converting America from a creditor nation to a debtor nation, which occurred in 1985 under Ronald Reagan's watch. So free trade has been an unmitigated disaster. Trade deficits do matter because a trade deficit is indicative of actually lost wealth. I support as the engines of the economy what I call the 6 sources of a nation's wealth: manufacturing, mining, agriculture, infrastructure, research and development, and education. That is translatable into creating wealth to better people's lives and to protect the nation. That kind of wealth is power. And in order to a nation to survive, you need power. not just the finance, insurance, and real estate industries, which is based on making money out of money. And I don't suggest that being abolished, quite the contrary. But the primary engine of the economy should be the 6 sources of wealth, and national economic policy will be refocused away from incentivizing the fire industries or solely the fire industries, move away from financial speculation, well, not totally suppressing it, obviously, and moving it towards the 6 sources of wealth. Now, trade with neutrals and allies, what I would do is I would trade based on the quality of the product. The problem is our trade rivals, forget our geopolitical adversaries who we trade with. Our trade rivals like Japan, Germany, South Korea, and others, they will use non-product related comparative advantages to hammer our remaining and previous industries. Currency speculation, loans by government subsidized or nationalized banks. This is in the case of South Korea for half a century. Dumping by state subsidized or state-owned industries. Take POSCO Steel, for example. It's the steel corporation, state-owned steel corporation. It's been around longer than I've been alive in South Korea. Or the China Steel Company in Taiwan. This is nationalized. We can't, U.S. Steel, or what used to be U.S. Steel because of different mergers over the decades, they can't compete with that. So I would enact tariffs on a progressive level up to an average of 25% incrementally to meet that non-product related so-called competition. Don't listen to Milton Friedman and other economists who say that cheap goods and dumping is a subsidy for the American consumer. Tell that bullshit to somebody in Gary, even though, yes, in Whiting and in East Chicago, you have the oil industries and some of the refineries. In Gary, you have two integrated mills, at least when I was looking at the Google Earth maps and research. It's a shadow of itself. Same with Cleveland as examples. Tell that's a subsidy for the American consumer. I dare you, goes to Milton Friedman or Donald Boudreaux of George Mason University. I dare you to tell them and look them in the eye. Maybe they'll have a cup of coffee and smash it over your head when they're done, because that's their family's affected. So when we look at trade with China, Russia, Vietnam, through subsidiaries with Iran and Cuba, because we've traded with Iran and Cuba through subsidiaries. I mean, not a lot of people realize that. Trade with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, at least until some of the sanctions started to be put in place by Trump, really, a little bit by Obama, more by Trump. And Biden is kind of trying to loosen it a little bit for reasons I'm not going to get into right now. Did trade make those countries like us? No. I mean, Lenin talked, the first dictator of the Soviet Union, he talked about how the capitalists will sell the rope to hang themselves. And even if you don't believe the veracity of that quote, I encourage people to look at the records of the debate on foreign concessions that the Soviets had. It's available to text on Marxist.org, where you get primary source Marxist and communist literature. And Lenin talked about the greed of the capitalists, how they're competing with each other to get entry into the Soviet market. It's very real. They laugh at the greed, this sociopathic greed of many of our capitalists, of our billionaires. And they know they're subsidizing and helping and giving political legitimacy to expansionist, militaristic, totalitarian police states that believe in totalitarian collectivism, the total subordination of the individual to the state, and replete with massive human rights violations. They incorporate all this technology into weapon systems that are used ultimately against the free world. And when you create dependent economic interests within the free world, where in capitalist societies, let's be honest with you, the capitalists have much more clout in the United States than most other interest groups. You don't think the Russians and the Chinese and the old Soviet Union and National Socialist Germany didn't know that? I've written about this and others have written about it. It is very clear they do. And so what these countries' governments will do is they will use the capitalists as their own propagandists to gain entry into Washington, D.C., into Berlin, Bonn, and London, and others, to influence legislators in those countries, politicians, whether in the parliament, at the Bundestag, the Congress, to say, well, Russia and China, they're not so bad. They really want peace. They want economic development. And who cares about human rights violations? It's all about money, and we don't care because we're sociopaths and whatnot. They don't say that all the time. But, that's what it comes down to. And it neutralizes basically people like me who are warning of the militarism of Russia and China, the untrustworthiness of Vietnam or Saudi Arabia or Cuba or Venezuela, or maybe we shouldn't invest in North Korea or whatever. So that's my take on free trade. Free trade has been an unmitigated disaster on many fronts. I'm not for walling off from goods, but I would like to see, it's easier said than done, but we need to have a bipartisan plan to decouple from Russia and especially China. And then ultimately Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, to list some other major trade partners that I would deem untrustworthy or just atrocious from a human rights perspective. And yeah, that's what I would be for. Why am I for this? To enhance our national security. Adam Smith, wrote in essence that, national defense comes before opulence, was the word he used. And I agree with Adam Smith on that. I think Frederick Bastiat was wrong, and I think it was Jean Baptiste say that, if goods don't cross borders, armies will, which is supposedly attributed to Frederick Bastiat, or, Jean-Baptiste Say, the author and creator of Say's Law and Supply and Demand. He says nations in the scheme of things are friends with each other. It's all nonsense. And greedy, corrupt capitalist elements that will fund libertarian and conservative and free trade internationalists and globalist think tanks and fake grassroots groups that will peddle that. Why? Because big business is making tons of money. They don't care about our national security. And what would happen is then, they basically use these grassroots as groups and say, oh, we're voices of the people. It's not true. It's not true at all. They're voices of plutocratic interests. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the letter that merchants have no country. They basically, their only homeland is the wares they sell. And that's really what it comes down to. And really the existential issue that I will hit on until the day I die or quit politics is the problem of reconciling the needs of capitalism with the needs of the national interest. And that's what it comes down to. And free trade has been detrimental to that. And I'm for reindustrialization in the United States. I remember the industries back when I was younger, really, really young. You get a sense of pride when you see steel mills and auto plants and lumber companies and all kinds of factories and mines pumping out their products. And as long as the jobs were, the employees were reasonably paid, they were pillars in the community. Many of these companies, and still do, they still exist, are fund community churches, charities, local public schools, PTAs, sports teams, and everything. That's the kind of capitalism and trade regime that I support. So I'm a staunch supporter of what I call the American School of Political Economy, which started with Alexander Hamilton. National Bank dispersing credit to industrialize the United States, infrastructure, and tariffs, and a tariff regimen. But I would not just do it like that tomorrow. You have to do this incrementally. It's like the United States is trade relationship with the world is like someone on crack and cocaine. Okay, you got to wean them off slowly. You can't just jolt them like that, like boom, because then it's going to be a shock to the system. You got to wean it slowly. And you got to look at the issue in a nuanced fashion and not only use tariffs and maybe nationalizing the Federal Reserve into what I would term the third national bank, but I would also look at the infrastructure improvements that you and I support. I would look at refocusing capitalism away of excessive financialization and shareholder supremacy and more towards a balance of the needs of the shareholder, the nations, the communities, etc. So that's my take on economics, trade. I think unions, I agree with what you said on unions. They are necessary. It's like business. Business has its good and bad points. Unions have their good and bad points. Both are necessary. Both are imperfect, but you should never throw the baby without the bathwater. And that's my take on that issue.
Well, apparently you are the more passionate one here this evening. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we largely agree on all this. Like, there might have been like a little bit of nuance there that I might have picked issue with, but
That's okay.
yeah, but like I'm not going to get into that. So there's one more topic that we wanted to talk about at least when we were doing the preliminary, and that was getting into like the situation in Ukraine. I've been trying to follow that pretty well. A lot of people are kind of have been asking me. It's like, hey, what do you think? Some people are like, oh, hey, they're going to win, right? And then some people are like, oh, maybe they're not going to win. Long and the short for me is that while I think the United States could literally mop the floor with Russia and China literally all at the same time, the fact that we are in the situation of where we don't really support Ukraine like what we have been because we've gotten rid of all the spare toys, for lack of a better term, Ukraine is unfortunately faltering. There's two major reasons of this. One, the weapons transfers from the West is significantly slowed down because we've really ran out of all the spare stuff. We're talking about auxiliary units and second line unit stuff is that we're sending now. Whether it be the M1 Abrams stuff that we're sending, we are now sending our front line main battle tank. It's just stripped, right? Which is not something we necessarily want to be sending. Now, I don't know why we're not sending Stingray out, but maybe they don't build very many of them. But yeah, Abrams is out.
You mean Stinger missiles?
Stingray. There's an export tank that the United States makes called Stingray, and I believe they're up to Stingray 3, maybe even Stingray 4 now. They make a handful of them a year. They export them to like world arms markets just to have people to have enough. And my good friend is actually telling me in chat that we just don't build enough of them, which I totally believe. But yeah, it's basically just kind of a knockoff version of the Abrams, but it's actually like cost effective for its price versus the stripped out Abrams. Anyway, we have the F-16 has been deployed last year, at least in a small amount. The real kicker about that is they won't have combat effective pilots in the F-16 until this year. Like the reality that we're kind of just digging into is that we're talking about sending Leopards. We're talking about sending stuff that we don't necessarily want our enemies to get a hold of, even if it's the stripped down generic version, right? So the way that it looks like we're going into 2024 is that Ukraine's losing steam, unfortunately. They're running out of manpower because they basically mobilized every man that they could. And while they have what the preliminary reports really do indicate is that the Ukrainians are scoring 5-1 casualties against the Russians. The problem is they need about 10-1 casualties to actually win. So the Russians still have the attritional momentum, if you will. Yeah. What we have been hoping for last year is kind of a repeat of what they had at the end of 2020. at the end of 2022, which is the Thunder runs, where they were able to go through the Russian lines and basically just sweep them up before they could actually like hunker down and defend anything. Well, unfortunately, when you decide to deploy more landmines than you can of any other industrial equipment, it's slowed down the Ukrainians. We are hoping that this year they will have all of the next batch of goodies with the new mine clearing equipment that we've sent them and everything, that they've got one last opportunity to turn this into a war mobility. If they are successful in doing so, they can literally roll up the Russian line like a carpet. But if they fail to do so, they probably lose the war this year. Not in an absolute term where they will have to surrender, but they will no longer actually be able to retake them the momentum at any point in the war following. This is basically the same thing that happened to the Germans in 43. They get like that last chance to kind of reverse the tide, but if they fail, they will completely fail. They will fail forever. That's kind of Ukraine's situation, which means that the conversation going into 2025 very likely will be, if Ukraine fails to maintain the momentum and the Russians just slowly eke, yard by yard, kilometer by kilometer, eventually start gaining the momentum, does the Poles join in? Does the Romanians join in? And then, of course, does just NATO join in? The reality here that this actually turns into a nuclear conflict is actually pretty high. I don't want to be a panicker when I say this, but I don't think the West is actually going to let Ukraine fall. I really don't. I think sooner or later, depending on who's in the White House and a few other key positions, sooner or later you're going to have a couple of countries just go all in. That's kind of my fear. My hope was that we would just prove that Western arms are just so awesome in the hands of trained combat professionals that we would see Ukraine have one of the biggest upsets in military history. And while they have dramatically overperformed compared to what we thought they were going to do, the reality is that when the Russians have been able to dust out their old defensive playbook and just slowly grind them down and stop, the Ukrainians have not been able to circumnavigate that. And if they can, it's just over for them. So I will take questions or any kind of criticisms to that, but when I saw 9 mechanized brigades get thrown into the offensive last year, and it just fell after not even making it a mile, I don't have a lot of hope right now. I really don't.
Yeah, no, I think and one of the things I really applaud you is your deep knowledge of military equipment and battles and tactics. And, I have to humbly admit you're more knowledgeable than I am. It's not to say I'm ignorant of that. And I certainly don't, I do understand and follow exactly what you're saying. I've heard similar data, but you really know the specs, and I really give you a lot of credit for that. Follow-up question, though.
Sure.
What do you think we should do? Because are you rooting for Putin? Because otherwise I'm going to kick you off the show.
No. As I've said earlier, unfortunately, it looks like Ukraine is kind of getting in a position where they lose. So, I would hope that would show my bias here. What it really comes down to. No,
that's fine. I am very anti-Russian government, not Russian people, but I'm very anti-Putin and United Russia Party. Go ahead.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Putin regime, and he's basically a new czar. Let's be real here. While it is better, quote unquote, than the old Soviet system, it's not much of an improvement. We basically traded out authoritarian communism for authoritarian fascism, to be completely honest. So it's just one of those deals where it's not really an improvement much for the Russians or their own people. What I would like to see is I'll put it this way. The problem is we're always a day late and a dollar short on this battle. We keep giving them the stuff that they need at the 6 months after they need it. That's been consistently hounding us since the operations really started kicking off. At this point, if Ukraine is just not able to take the new stuff that we give them and really be able to forward deploy this during the next offensive season here that's going to come up in summer, you're just basically looking at NATO forces just in Kiev at that point. I think that's literally what it's going to require, is just tell the Russians, we're done with your shit. If you want to fight, it's on. If you want to nuke half the planet, go for it, because we do not accept what you're going for. Like, you just need someone with quote unquote big dick energy to come in and just tell Vlad that his terms are not acceptable. That's the only thing you can do. It's a very peace through strength mentality. And do I know? Am I willing to absolutely say for certain that the Russians won't throw off a nuke or two? I I don't know for sure. I think they won't, as long as they still have the off ramp of defeat. But if you're talking about like civilizational collapse, which we could totally force on them, yeah, they will throw the nukes. But I know there's a lot of people are like, oh, if we go into Crimea or if we go into, Russia proper, as long as the American stars and stripes aren't over Moscow, I don't think that's on the table. I think it's if we, I think it's basically if the Russians are convinced that we will destroy the Russian government writ large, that's when we have a problem. But if we just walk in and literally just be like, hey, you know what? We've given you red line after red line after red line, and we haven't followed through with it. So this time we are. Get out, or we literally start bombing next year, or tomorrow, and we actually follow through with it. I think the Russians will know we're serious enough to back out of that conversation. But you're still talking about a direct armed shooting fight between two nuclear armed nations and the ones that have the most nukes. It's a significant risk, but I think that's the only option we have at this point.
Well, yeah, it's a very complicated issue. I think, I support Ukraine within the limits and capabilities that the United States and the NATO countries could support Ukraine as much as our industrial base can support. And this is another case and reason why we need to vastly expand our industrial base so we could be the arsenal of so-called quote-unquote democracy. We're not in that position. Philip Pilkington of the Journal of American Affairs, and I think his name is Brendan Weichart of the Washington Times, have written articles which pointed out, replete with statistics, about how our degraded industrial base is affecting our ability to resupply Ukraine. And this has been an old problem in varying times in our recent history. Putin has mentioned at the Valdai Economic Summit recently that the United States cuts off aid and the West cuts off aid, particularly the United States to Ukraine. They're done. Very similar to what happened to South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos after the U.S. Congress was progressively axing aid to our allies in Southeast Asia. And then the superior numbers and equipment of the North Vietnamese, Khmer Rouge, and Pathet Lao conquered those three countries in holding power in 2 out of 3, by the way, still to this day, as allies of Russia, by the way, and China on the global stage today. The problem I see with Ukraine is a larger strategic issue. Russia's intentions is ultimately for Europe is to, quote, Dmitry Medvedev, a top Putin ally and served in the Russian government for well over a decade, deputy head of the National Security Council, Putin's prime minister, and others, president of Russia, unofficially or officially, with Putin running the things behind the scenes. And Medvedev said in 2020, he admitted that the goals of Russia is to create this grand Eurasian Union from Vladivostok to Lisbon, Portugal. And when you look at Russia's activities in Europe, them funding and having ties through their quote-unquote diplomats with various extremists to the left and the right in Europe, Jobbik in Hungary, what used to be called the FN, National Front in France, now it's the RN, which has been funded by the Russians through some of their banking fronts in Czech Republic, but the AFD in Germany. They've had support from various tanky Marxist-Leninist groups in Europe, like Die Linke in Germany. Russia's allies, Iran and Venezuela, support Podemos in Spain, allegedly. So you have this global reach of Russia to ultimately neutralize and break up NATO, I would argue, and establish hegemony in Europe. Why is that bad for the United States? You're thinking, oh, it's on the other side of the ocean. Well, because of globalism and free trade, we have a certain level of dependency and interconnectedness with Europe. including imports, industrial imports from Germany. You look at vehicles from Germany, ThyssenKrupp elevators, et cetera, et cetera. You get where I'm going with that. And Russia dominating Europe could potentially, we have to think long term at possibilities, could potentially interrupt that trade. So we have to be careful about that. And if you combine German industry with Russia's military power and population, that's a pretty potent potential combination. And that's something that Russia has worked on and off for well over a century. Combining the power of German industry and technology with Russia's population and troops serving in their military forces. So we have to take a look at that. So that's
very
why
good thing
that's why I do support. I'm very concerned about the fall of Ukraine. I'll let you go with that.
Yeah, it's very good that at least in their history that anytime that the Russians and the Germans interact, that it's always a very nasty affair. But more particularly is that even when the Russians actually finally got control of Germany, or at least even a significant portion of it, they just literally stole everything from it. And it turns out that unfortunately for the Russians, the Germans are still better at running stuff even when the German stuff is in Russia. So I'm not super worried about like what the Russian Grand's plan here is, because it's at least in my mind, it's not even feasible anymore. You're talking about a country that is, it basically in what is going to be their final generation of existence. They may be the biggest ethnic group in all of Europe, but at least from the data that we've seen, there is a 50% drop in Russians that are younger than me, right? Just in the general birth rate. And at least from all the data that we've seen, it probably didn't get any better. It might actually even have gotten worse with the fact that they are surrounded with tuberculosis and AIDS, and I can't remember what the other one is. We're talking about a peoples that are dying out as an ethnicity. There might not be a Russia by the turn of the century, or excuse me, not at the turn of the century, like the mid-century. We may see Russia just fall apart to another like Soviet style collapse to where we see Chechnya become independent. I really want to see what happens to the Tartars, actually. Don't get me wrong. Russia can still win in Ukraine, but it's probably the last war that they can wage on this level of scale. Like if they fight anybody else outside of like Moldova, right, they're going to get absolutely eviscerated. And if they do that, there's no one to run Russia, into the future. I can get into the conversations about how they were drafting a number of peoples that aren't ethnically Russian, like they've been drafting largely the Sibir and a few other peoples that are largely for the Russians undesirables. But at least from the casualties that we're seeing here, the Russians have probably lost 1 million people between the ages of 20 and 40. 1 million men, between the ages of 20 and 40, just in this fight now. It may be that high as far as just general casualties. And it looks like they probably lost another 1 million men whenever the draft started, and everyone was trying to get the hell out. It was like
in 2022, especially. Yes, there's definitely truth to that. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So, I'm not super optimistic on Russia's long-term prospects, but like they can get to 2030 and still be a very let's just say nasty hangover for everybody. But I don't think they become more than that unless they decide to literally walk into the Baltic states, in which case that's their own doing and they will get horribly, horribly annihilated. China is actually the one that I think is going to go before they do. China is, I've been saying this for a while. China, it was a house of cards that sooner or later, one of the major problems within their system was going to start catching up to them. And I have watched in the last 2 years where I was saying, hey, I don't think China's going to make it to 2030. And people were like, you're crazy, whatever. To now the headlines in the last particular 3 months from a lot of economists and through a lot of people who are within different industries are saying, China is throwing up red flags left, right, and center. It looks like the system overall has no communication. And a great example of this is the spy balloon from last year, if you remember this. A lot of people are like, oh, hey, the Chinese are just ruffling our feathers. Let me tell you how stupid this was. The Chinese took a spy balloon, put all their, inlet on it to where they were collecting data and whatnot, and trying to send it back. But let's be real here. Everything that they could have collected on that spy balloon, you can collect with literally a mid-grade spy satellite, right? And no one's going to interfere with that or even care because you can't see it. Literally, sometimes 80, 60 miles up. Sometimes it's even far higher than that. What the issue was is that China actually horrifically goofed. And if she's calling the shots, there's no one telling him he's an idiot. Because what we did, instead of shooting it down like a lot of people thought we should have done, we parked a helicopter under the thing, we parked a U-2 on top of the thing, and just let it swerve around. And we got one whole week of signals intelligence off this thing. We cracked all their codes, which most of them we already had cracked. But more importantly, we tracked all where the information was going to the single IP address and the actual machines that were running it. We just had the intelligence goldmine of the decade, and no one admitted it because the Biden administration actually could not be bothered to take a victory lap and just say, hey, the Chinese actually just royally screwed up here. When you're doing stuff like this to where you're just launching spy balloons and it's very clear the State Department didn't even know because she found out about it, according to U.S. diplomat or U.S. State Department, through Biden. Biden literally has a conversation with them 2 months later. And he's like, hey, we really didn't appreciate that balloon. You might want to do that. And she's like, what balloon? We may be in the situation to where she has effectively turned himself into a neo-emperor, like what we've seen in a lot of Chinese history. But the Forbidden Palace is getting no one into it because he's killed everyone or scared everybody off. And if that's actually the case, we're looking at a Chinese-style collapse, which what we've seen at least 4 times in their own history, where the Forbidden City just has no power to influence everybody else because they don't know what's going on. And if that's actually the case, China's days are severely numbered. And I will remind your audience, just to not be too much of a windbag, we are talking about a society.
You're good.
Yeah, we are talking about a society that there was plenty of videos of this where during COVID, we're not going to get a vaccine that actually works. We're going to make our own that has a 5% effectiveness rate. But instead, we're going to find it completely usable and ethical to weld you into your apartment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is not a society or a system that screams longevity to me. This is a system that is saying, oh, our number one financial asset, which is real estate, just had its 3rd biggest company in the world crash last year, and they did nothing about it. I think the system's literally off the wheels, and no one has, or only people are now starting to realize it yet. I wouldn't be surprised if there's already the fire that kills China is already burning, but we just can't see it yet because it hasn't gotten, past the kindling.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
And I take your points, and I'm familiar with the substance of what you're saying. However, I take more of a cautionary view on underestimating Russia and China. I mean, for example, they have their weaknesses. I think American power is vastly overrated. I think if we were talking in terms of the 1950s, 1960s, we would be having a different conversation, whereas the Soviets at that time, they had more of an advantage when it came to the apparatus of intelligence and subversion of their enemies. But the United States was far ahead in regards to technological superiority and industrial base, even though the Soviet Union on paper had quite a bit of industrial assets, which is very important. But today we've really exported a lot of our national power. Our birth rate is also having severe problems for a variety of different reasons, including especially the affordability of having children. Our military is having a massively difficult time recruiting, and there have been reports by the DoD stretching as far back as the G.W. Bush administration in the early 2000s regarding that, to the effect where we couldn't even survive a weapons of mass destruction attack, according to the DoD and Homeland Defense Security reports and the National Guard and whatnot. We just did not have the assets, in part because we could not recruit enough troops. There is a demoralization in the United States. We see how this country did not unify under COVID, but in fact divided. And I have my opinions as to really what COVID was. Where it emanated from. I really can't talk about this on Twitch or YouTube, otherwise I'll get striked because of it. But yeah, basically it was almost possibly a declaration of war, shall we say. We'll leave it at that. We did not unify as a population. We were more divided than ever. That's a problem. When it comes to Russia and China, we see the Russians in the field, their command and control is inferior compared to the Ukrainians, which were taught by the Americans, which was far superior command and control. But the Russians, and of course the Chinese, they have the industrial base, they have the population numbers, and that is a cause of concern for me. When it comes to, and this is where I might sound loopy, especially to people in your audience, because it's not a popular opinion, and that is that Russia and China, when they are going through their weak periods, when they're having problems, they will launch their own versions of glasnost and perestroika and controlled reforms from above. The Russians and the Chinese did it during when they were monarchies. The Chinese did that with the under Empress CZ, under use of barbarian to control the barbarian, meaning use the West to revivify China. The Russians did the same under Tsar, well, particularly under Tsar Alexander III and Count Sergei to revitalize Russia. And sometimes it was effective, sometimes it was not. The Soviets did that under Lenin, under NEP. They did it under Gorbachev to try and revitalize Russia. Then they had what was arguably a controlled collapse. Look at Jared Nyquist's interviews with the SVR, Russian SVR KGB whistleblower, Viktor Kalashnikov, who revealed that it was a controlled collapse, basically. Because Russia, even though it had some important industrial assets, population, they had more nuclear weapons, numerically more tanks, they were also having problems too as well. And they needed that infusion of technology. They needed to also show at times that they were much weaker than they actually were. If you show that you're weaker than you are, you have the element of surprise. Russian and Chinese strategists look at the global correlation of forces, as the old Soviet strategists and Russian strategists term it, and they see, like in the business world, they look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, which is, of course, is what's taught in business and training and the professional world. And they look at it very coldly and they see what can they get away with and get the most mileage of and what they don't. And they go through these controlled periods of reforms and strategic retreats, and then they slowly build themselves up again and see what they can get away with. What would an outcome in a World War III between Russia and China and the United States would be? It's very difficult to tell because both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, which I've outlined some of them, and you have outlined them. Don't know, but I do know that China and Russia can inflict severe damage on the United States continentally. I think we have to be very cautious about overestimating our capabilities. I think we have to take an honest look at what our weaknesses are and plug them in really fast. And I could go on and on more. I'm sorry to promote my books, but look at my book, Red Dawn in Retrospect. Look at, for example, which talks about some of these issues. I would take a look about Russia's deception and controlled retreats. Look at Edward J. Epstein's book, Deception, the Invisible War Between the CIA and the KGB. You know, people were saying, oh, Russia could never put moles in the CIA. And the FBI. Look at Robert Hansen. Look at Aldrich Ames. Not only did they do it for money, but they did it because of ideology, because they did not like American national security policy and whatnot. You take a look at what China has done. China's control the number of CIA assets. They use false defectors. The Russians have done that during even the Cold War. Why wouldn't they replicate successful strategies? They've actually had people that will give disinformation to, like Yuri Nasenko, like Vitaly Yurchenko, look at Top Hat and Fedora, were all CIA, FBI assets, and they deliberately downplayed the technological, I don't want to say superiority, but the technological prowess of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. Top Hat and Fedora, who are Soviet or double agents, Soviet double agents, they actually were saying, oh, Russia never, they were inferior in biological and chemical weapons. And of course, we learned later that that was incorrect, that the CIA and FBI downplayed or Russian and Chinese weapons of mass destruction capabilities. So look, the Russians and Chinese are not 10 feet tall, but they're not midgets either at the same time. And I think we just have to take a dispassionate look. And I tend to maybe be a little bit of an alarmist, but I'd rather be over-prepared than under-prepared and rest on our laurels and say, oh, la-di-da-di-do, everything's fine, everything's wonderful, we're not going to get attacked, we're not vulnerable. Then, of course, 9/11 happened. Then COVID happened. Look, there were defeats of the CIA on various fronts in the intelligence war, too, as well. And maybe people in your chat might start saying, hey, he's making sense, he's making good points, or maybe they're saying I'm a relic of the Cold War. But let me tell you, you look at the works of J.R. Nyquist, you look at the works of Trevor Loudon, the works that I have published and whatnot, the Cold War has not ended. People were saying, oh, the Russian reset. Oh, Russia's our friend. Putin, George Bush, I remember it. Him saying that I've looked Putin in the eyes and I saw my own soul. Well, Russia was massively rearming then and supporting anti-American countries globally while we were in denial about that. We gave Russia permanent normal trade relations. Massive infusions of this technology to our supposed friend Russia at the time enhanced Russian weapon systems. Much has been in the British and American press about when the Ukrainians and NATO advisors opened up and dissected, if there's a lack of a better term, Russian weapon systems. There were plenty of German and American and East Asian, Japanese components in there, to list some of the countries that further enhanced Russian weapon systems. So this notion of the Cold War, Russia, became a nice little pussycat instead of a cranky bear, it's just not true. People on my side, and to some degree your side, have been vindicated. But many on the right, ironically, within the MAGA crowd, are basically very trusting of Putin. They think that he's a kindred spirit. Absolutely not. He's a product of a communist culture. He has admitted that he likes communist and socialist values. He has supported communist front events like the World Youth Festival in Sochi in 2017. And then he's holding another iteration of the World Youth Festival in March of 2024, of which a variety of American and global communists, like the Center for Political Innovation, the Party of Communists USA, and what else? And the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists are all participating. So that's my take on that, on Russia's strengths and weaknesses. I just say beware and re-strengthen our fundamentals. We re-strengthen our fundamentals and get real about Russia and China, then I think we'll be okay in the long run. But until then, to conclude that, I think we need to support Ukraine within the best of our abilities and capabilities. And I would go from there. And I would really start to take an honest look at the fundamental weaknesses of the United States and rebuild from within. Because there's a lot of talented people, especially out there like you, Tiberius, and other people. There is a talented pool of people, technically latent talent, that can really form a new leadership core that can affect positive change in the United States. That's all I have to say. Any concluding remarks or comments on what I have to say? Anything in chat?
Look, well, I mean, I'm going to let chat be chat because I usually don't bring them in. But I will simply suffice it to say, like, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We're at 2 hours, and as much as I would love to continue this conversation, the problem is that I need to get ready for bed, and we've already been going for 2 hours. So let's put a pin in on this particular episode. But I'm sure, actually, I would be very interested if your audience would like me back. I'm definitely going to check it out on the YouTube whenever it gets uploaded, see what people had to say. And if they want to bring me back on, we can have a whole nother round of conversation. How's that sound to you?
Yeah, no, sounds good. I'd like to have you back on the channel. I've had guests from across the spectrum. I definitely appreciate your support for Ukraine, so that's a big plus. A good chunk of my audience are staunch critics of the Russians and the Chinese and are anti-communist, so I think that would be pretty cool. We might have somewhat differing opinions on the relative strength of Russia and China versus the United States, but I think as a core value system, you and I are very similar, so that's cool. And I can go on and on about this, but both of us have to go to bed. Again, where can people find your channel, your work, any writings that maybe you've done in the past?
I had a blog spot once upon a time. However, I'm not sure if it's even findable at this point. But yeah, like I largely just hang out on Twitch and YouTube. If you want to catch out my live content, yeah, feel free to do that. My name is Tyberius D. It's with a Y, not an I. A lot of people will have a little trouble finding that. But outside of that, if you want to get a hold of me, I'm on pretty much all the social medias. I think I've got all the written social medias down. Like I'm on X, former Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Threads, I'm on a lot of these things. The only thing I think I have to add on to now at this point is I think I have to actually start streaming on Kick because it looks like Twitch is dying. But without further ado, if you are interested in anything I had to say, please feel free to come over, hang out with us, ask us questions. Hell, maybe even join one of the open panels. We're usually pretty open about it, or at least we'll just ask. It's like, hey, where do we know you from? Like, why did we bring you on? Just say that, hey, I watched you with Nevin, and we'll probably let you in. So anyway, that's all I got for you, sir. Hopefully you enjoyed this wonderful 2 hours.
No, I did. I think it was a great conversation. I think there was a lot of views, a lot of evidence that's being thrashed about. And I think it was a great discussion. I look forward to more. Ideally, I'd like to have you at bare minimum, possibly once a month. I think you make a good regular guest. You're very knowledgeable. I appreciate that. Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year, Tiberius. Again, I forgot to open with that. My apologies to the audience. Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Take care, everybody.
Okay. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.